every Taliban unit that comes into Afghanistan comes from Pakistan. They all have command links to Shura members, used to be called the Rakhbari Shura. There are now various shuras with regional names, Quetta, Miram Shah, Peshawar, that are in Pakistan. And when those shuras sit down, I know from having spoken to Taliban commanders, there is an ISI, there is a Pakistani army officer in the room, usually the person giving the orders, saying what priorities are to be addressed next.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. I was based in Moscow for NBC when the Twin Towers and the Pentagon were attacked by Al-Qaeda. And that meant I was the closest network news reporter to Afghanistan. I hitched a ride with the Taliban's archenemy, the Northern Alliance, out of Dushanbe, Tajikistan, and landed in northern Afghanistan on a resupply gun run, as they called it, short on food, sitting on boxes of ammunition, and one of the first correspondents to enter the country as America started its bombing campaign. I have been in and out of Afghanistan a few dozen times, embedded with U.S. troops over the years. It pains me the country is sliding back now towards Taliban rule, as the American Biden administration cuts and runs after so much effort to stand up an independent government. On this backstory, a former Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, Chris Alexander. He has remarkable insight on the country and its neighbor, Pakistan. And Major General Walter Givhan, who ran U.S. air operations at Bagram Air Base. We flew together in a Russian helicopter with a former Soviet Afghan pilot who was being retrained by the U.S. Air Force to resupply and support the new Afghan army. All right, Chris Alexander served for 18 years as a Canadian diplomat, including as the first resident Canadian ambassador in Afghanistan. And he also in 2011 published a book called Afghanistan's Quest for Peace. The title is actually The Long Way Back, Chris, so forgive me for that. Back is probably the key word right now, as in going backwards very quickly. Would you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I chose that title deliberately because I was hopeful 10 years ago that Afghanistan could achieve stability and peace. But we were already taking the long way towards that goal because we weren't dealing with the fundamental issue, which was Pakistan's sponsorship of the Taliban and their allies. And since my book came out, we've had Carlotta Gall, who wrote a book called The Wrong War, which is literally about how we should have been taking Pakistan to task rather than fighting the Taliban only on Afghanistan's territory. Steve Cole came out with Directorate S, which starts to profile the institution in Pakistan's intelligence community that runs the war in Afghanistan. But 10 years have elapsed, Dana, and no one has done anything politically to address this issue.
10 years has elapsed since your book, but 20 years has elapsed since this
and 20 years since 9/11. Exactly.
But I mean, the Americans did say that at a certain point, you know, they wagged their fingers at Pakistan. They threatened to withhold funding. They pressured Pakistan on enforcing the border and stopping the Taliban from crossing over. So, but let's give you the benefit of the doubt on all of that they didn't really directly deal with it. And there is no evidence that they did. So the question is, why didn't they? Why couldn't they take Pakistan on?
Well, the classic statement of that reasoning comes from Joe Biden himself, who famously said, and I think Steve Cole quotes this, others have quoted it, Pakistan is 7 to 10 times bigger by population than Afghanistan. Pakistan is a much more important country than Afghanistan. And the implication coming from him is we don't really care about you, little Afghanistan. We want our strategic relationship with Pakistan, a de facto nuclear weapon state, to continue. Moreover, U.S. forces were using Pakistan as their logistics hub, as their the territory over which goods that came by sea were moved to supply the operation in Afghanistan. So paradoxically,
partially, but yeah, there were definitely air bases in there that they were moving goods in and out.
It was kilogram for kilogram, ton for ton. It was the most important staging area for U.S. supplies. All heavy equipment came in that way. Oil, fuel, and other supplies came that way. Many of us thought they should be lessening, seeing the strategic quandary on the horizon, thought that they should be lessening their strategic reliance on Pakistan, but the decision was made not to.
It's ridiculous, right? You're fighting an enemy that is taking safe haven in Pakistan, the Taliban, in the frontier areas, but with a wink and a nod, you're still using Pakistani territory as your staging base for American forces who are being attacked by the enemy from that area. I mean, it just doesn't get any stranger.
It's not only strange; it's unprecedented in its. In the 19th century, when the British engaged in policies like this, you called it perfidy, right? It was not an honorable position. It was not a principled position. It was something duplicitous and ultimately dangerous. Well, I don't think we've seen, certainly not in the 21st century or any time recently, a major country, a superpower, backing two sides in a conflict, in which not just two sides in a conflict, but two sides, one of which included its own soldiers. I mean, the US lost over 2,000 servicemen and women in Afghanistan. And arguably, the main belligerent causing their deaths was a state that George Bush called a major non-NATO ally. That is not just incoherence in foreign policy, that's dangerous hypocrisy.
You said arguably, because the Americans would say, yes, the ISI, Pakistani intelligence, was playing in Afghanistan. They were duplicitous one moment, saying that they were going to help the Afghan government, the other moment pulling the rug out and helping the Taliban. But some would say that you overstate the ISI or Pakistan's role in the Taliban's resistance war, if you want to call it that. And that's probably an unfair term.
Sure. And these are the people who are causing Afghanistan its new agony. The denialists, the people who argue that Pakistan isn't playing this principal role, are the ones prolonging this war. There is absolutely no evidence for their for the case they're making. Every Taliban unit that comes into Afghanistan comes from Pakistan. They all have command links to Shura members, used to be called the Rakhbari Shura. There are now various shuras with regional names, Quetta, Miram Shah, Peshawar, that are in Pakistan. And when those shuras sit down, I know from having spoken to Taliban commanders, there is an ISI, there is a Pakistani army officer in the room, usually the person giving the orders, saying what priorities are to be addressed next. Now, the people who are claiming that the ISI has no role are the ones who haven't studied this carefully, who haven't spoken to the victims, who haven't spoken to the combatants. And it's time that
you were deputy head of the UN now. You were the Canadian ambassador there. You for sure had conversations with the Pakistanis. What do you recall? What was the most direct conversation you ever had with a Pakistani official, and how did they respond?
Well, Pakistani officials, especially the ones in uniform, in their moments of greatest self-satisfaction and hubris, would acknowledge fully what they were doing. They would never do it on camera. They would never do it on the record. I don't have recordings of these things because that's not the way you operate as a diplomat. But they fully acknowledged that the Taliban were their guys, that they had taught them the art of suicide bombing, that they had maintained the pressure because the US was distracted in Iraq, and that they fully expected the US to leave and their team to take over.
Do they want to bring down the Afghan government and replace it with what?
Absolutely.
What is the long-term goal?
Absolutely. And here's where we are incoherent, inconsistent, and a little bit tragically ridiculous at the same time. We have sanctioned Russia under Putin backwards and forwards, should do more, but we've done quite a lot for a small invasion relative to what's happening in Afghanistan of Crimea and Donbass. Maybe 10, 12,000 people have died since 2014 in that conflict. Most countries have sanctioned Iran for its various proxy wars from Iraq to Lebanon to Syria to Yemen. Pakistan is waging a much larger proxy war, one that has killed our soldiers over 2 decades, one that threatens to plunge Afghanistan into a new phase of civil war, and no one lifts a finger. How are we ever going to claim to be upholders of international peace and security, the principles of the Charter, if after a 20-year NATO mission mandated by the UN, we still can't do anything to stop the main belligerent from destroying the country?
But what is the goal, Chris? I mean, the
goal is to
get the Taliban back to do what?
The goal is to get Pakistan to change its policy, to pay a price.
The goal by Pakistan, I meant, what are they trying to accomplish by pulling the rug out on the Afghan government, having the country, splinter again into different factional militias?
No, and they don't see it that way.
Power to get what?
If they have someone on top of a hill of bones and skulls in Kabul, it won't matter to them because it will be their person. Their policy is to be top dog in Kabul because they think anyone chosen by the Afghan people, or as was the case back in 2001, the international community under UN auspices, is going to be wise to their tricks and hostile to their interests. And indeed, they think anyone not chosen by them in Kabul will be listening to India more than to Islamabad. And I mean, look at it from their perspective. Karzai was educated in India. His father was killed by the ISI. Ashraf Ghani got his PhD in Denmark and was an American citizen for a good part of his life. He also has no time for this destructive proxy war that Pakistan has been waging for 43 years. They want someone there who will behave more like a provincial satrap, a provincial governor, and take orders not from Islamabad, but from Rawalpindi, where general headquarters is based.
There are now more than 124 areas that have been taken over by the Taliban. They control now roughly a third of the country by different estimates. Do you think that the Afghan army is done, or do you think taking some of those regional centers is one thing, but when you start moving on the bigger cities, including Kabul, that in fact the Afghan army may surprise us, and after all of this training and all this money, that they may actually stand up and hold ground and push the Taliban back?
Yes, I think the Afghan army and Afghans themselves have the capacity to fight. They will have the motivation to protect their communities, their families, their property, because they've seen this movie before, back in 1996, 2001. There are two wild cards for them. One is resupply of basic inputs for war fighting, from fuel to ammunition to vehicles and helicopters to give them mobility. And the other is air power. If the US really fails to support the Afghan National Air Force and denies Afghanistan air power from Central Command, which has been available for 20 years, then Afghan forces could fold very quickly. But I hope that cooler heads will prevail in Washington and that step won't be taken. And even by the most optimistic, maximalist estimates of how many Taliban there are in the field, they don't have remotely enough people to attack, take, and hold the entire country. I mean, look how little, relatively speaking, NATO ISAF was able to do, even at the height of the surge with over 100,000 troops in country. That pushed back the insurgency in the south, but it didn't rid Afghanistan of the Taliban. I don't think you will ever see a Taliban force in Afghanistan with remotely like those capabilities or that scale as a fighting force. And so this is going to be a stalemate and a civil war. And if it continues, and if Pakistan doesn't change course. And that's why there are voices, prominent voices today in Pakistan, despite threats to freedom to journalists, despite threats to politicians who are jailed and murdered almost every week in that country. There are people expressing grave doubts about what the chief of the army staff is doing, because it's his policy. This is not something that's been voted on in parliament or debated in the bazaars of Lahore. This is something that is being imposed because they've always done it, and that is also a holdover from the colonial policy of the British. So we're talking about a legacy of history here that is difficult to undo, but it has to be undone, because 43 years is far too much for any country to endure an unending war, and the behavior, the policy of the Pakistani army is the absolute height of irresponsibility.
I mean, the tragedy is, though, that Biden wants to turn his back on it. Trump wanted to do the same. The American appetite for staying in Afghanistan
that's right.
has evaporated unless there's another attack on America. And a lot of people say the Taliban's ties to Al Qaeda are certainly still in place. So here we go again.
There are many voices in the United States that think this is the wrong move. There are many who will be reminding Joe Biden that his predecessor as a Democratic president, Barack Obama, pulled the last troops out of Iraq in 2011, but they went back in 2014 because of the vacuum that created, because of the horrors of ISIS. These will be new horrors that a US president won't be able to ignore. Appeasement, turning away, indulging the negative emotions of isolationism. We've seen that all before. We've seen that in the 20s and 30s. We saw that in the 70s when there was a lot of drift in American foreign policy and hypocrisy in American foreign policy. We saw that again under Clinton and again under Obama. We saw terrible moves made under Trump and Bush, including the invasion of Iraq. Sooner or later, you have to do the right thing. And Afghanistan is not a marginal country. It is central to South Asia, to Southwest Asia. And it has been a focus for investment by the whole world for 20 years. There are a lot of people around the world in almost every country who think that legacy is worth protecting and not abandoning.
Your report card on American foreign policy was accurate, but not very flattering. And not very promising, probably. But Chris Alexander, the former Canadian ambassador to Kabul, who I've known since your days in Moscow when you were attached to the embassy there, it's always great to have your insight. It's a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. Thanks for doing this.
All right, joining us from Troy, Alabama, is Major General retired Walter Givhan, who led the effort to rebuild the Afghan Air Force as commanding general of the Combined Air Power Transition Force. And he's commanded a combat training squadron, an operations group, an air base wing, an air expeditionary wing, and was at the Air Force Institute of Technology. And I first met you, Walter, hello.
Yes.
At Bagram Air Base, which is making a bit of news right now.
I was listening in yesterday about the early departure from Bagram. Yeah.
And I think in fairness to the Biden administration, they have denied that they didn't do a handover, but whatever handover it was, it doesn't appear to have been as smooth running as it could have. And there was looting of Bagram Air Base by some of the people on the edge of the base. Does that break your heart in a way, given all of the efforts of American soldiers and from the Army to the Air Force to stand up that base and use it as an integral platform for bringing what people hoped would be peace to Afghanistan.
Yeah, it is. It really does hurt from someone who spent a year there and invested a lot of energy and time and effort into really building. And I believe very much in our efforts in Afghanistan. So to see, a very abrupt departure from a place like that, and to some of our, I don't know exactly what happened, but let's agree that a lot of our allies there felt like they weren't brought into the loop, or that it wasn't an orderly departure for whatever reason.
But you knew, when I saw you, when did you rotate out of Afghanistan?
I left Afghanistan in late September 2009. I was there September 2008, September 2009.
And even then, you knew it was inevitable that the Afghan army would have to stand up on its own, and you were helping the Afghan Air Force, because that's a hell of a big country. You were helping the Afghan Air Force to train and be able to deploy and be able to service the army, and also be able to carry out attacks if it had to.
Yeah. It's, you look at Afghanistan and it really begs for air power. And some people scratch their head. They say, what do you mean by that? And I say, well, if nothing else, look at it from a mobility perspective. You've got a large country with very poor infrastructure as far as roads and rail are concerned. You're going to have to get around by air, and that kind of ability to maneuver in the air is absolutely integral to an effective fighting force. And we were trying to stand that capability up for the Afghans because, frankly, we had started that effort sort of late after, we'd actually established our security presence there. So we were really playing catch up.
Well, I mean, there was some hesitancy in turning over too much firepower to the Afghan government, which nobody was sure was going to be able to hold the ground and be a real government. Was there not? I mean, how much power did you place in their hands? You didn't turn them over F-16s at that point. And when I was there, I was hoping you would arrange for me to get up in one of those A-10 tank killers or something romantic. But in fact, you put me in an Mi-8 helicopter, which is what you had armed the Afghan Air Force with, to really be able to carry out troop deployments and resupply missions.
Yeah, we needed them in the fight. We needed them in the fight then. So the quickest way to get them in the fight was give them the equipment that they knew, which in this case was Russian. Mi-17, which is the same as the Mi-8, just an advanced variation of that, the HIP.
It didn't feel very advanced, the one I was in.
Yeah, no. It's a little bit different, a little bit more powerful engines in the Mi-17 than the Mi-8, but the same airframe, really. And then the Mi-35 Heinz, the attack helicopters, that was the basis of it. Of course, the issue that we ultimately ran into, even as we did that, was the political one of, what, you're buying Russian helicopters? Well, of course, that's the quickest way to get them in the fight there. But ultimately, there has been in recent years a transition to some U.S. platforms to augment that. So they actually got a fairly significant air capability right now. The problem is going to be maintaining it.
Yeah, let's talk about that. But I mean, in fact, a lot of those Russian helicopters were brought out of places like Kazakhstan, and the money didn't go to the Russian government. They probably went to independent states like in the stands, the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, whatever.
Sure. Initially, we were getting helicopters and refurbishing them. We were getting them from various countries, but we ultimately had a deal with the Russians, and the Russians were. We had an exemption from the sanctions that were in place at that time, and we were able to actually buy directly from the Russians. We did a pretty large purchase from the Russians.
A very different President Putin then, because he allowed air corridors over his country with U.S. forces to bring large transport planes over Russia at that time, right? NATO aircraft.
Right. It was a very different time. And of course, as we got into later with what happened in Ukraine, it really became simply untenable to continue the effort directly with the Russians.
So what kind of aircraft does the Afghan Air Force have right now? Because we're talking about, can they hold the ground that is quickly disappearing from the Taliban?
Yeah, well, they've got quite a variety of aircraft. On the helicopter side that we were talking about, they still have some of the Mi-17s, Mi-35s, but they've started getting UH-60s, Blackhawks, U.S. helicopters. So they've got a significant presence of Blackhawks. Two of the aircraft that I started the procurement effort for that they got now is they've got the Cessna 208, the Caravan, which we had very good luck in Iraq with the Iraqi Air Force, and the A-29 Super Tucano, which is a single-engine turboprop, kind of a classic counterinsurgency close air support aircraft.
Armed with?
It'll carry a lot of different armaments, guns, bombs, that sort of thing, but primarily a bomb dropper. But a great aircraft and a proven close air support platform that we were very happy that ultimately we were able to procure for them.
But do you think the Afghan Air Force and Army can stand up without American firepower, that they can hold ground and they can take the fight to the enemy properly?
That's really the question, isn't it? And I think we're gonna see I think they will in certain areas. It's a large country, so it's hard to cover everything. And already I was just looking at the Air Force. They're having a very high op tempo right now. It's hard with all the demands for their support. It's really hard for them to keep this going. And of course, what I was talking about, the thing that people often don't think about, the maintenance and the logistics that sustains this is also that's a little bit tenuous. Especially,
it's what you're saying is really important, sir, because even the U.S. current administration extended the term of the contractors in Afghanistan right now because they feel that the Afghans cannot service those aircraft and they're not at the level that they can carry that on, and they need American support.
Yes, they do, and they're going to require that for a while. That is going to be absolutely critical to them. At the same time, the Afghans have an incredible resilience and resourcefulness. When I came in there, they had kept aircraft flying that you just wouldn't think you could keep it flying. I mean, they what down here in the southern part of the United States we call shade tree mechanics. They're the person who really knows how to get something done. It may not be, the book way, but they can get it going. So I think there's a resourcefulness there. But at the same time, they're going to have that supply line. They're going to have that expertise. And I'm also hoping that, we will augment their air power with American air power as we can, wherever that we would deploy that from out of theater or out of country. To try to assist them as well. I think that's going to be key to sustaining what they're doing there as well.
Do you think it's a mistake that we are leaving Afghanistan so quickly, and that there are some projections that this civil war could unfold at lightning speed, and that the Taliban could be back in charge there in 6 months? I mean, I don't think the advance is that rapid, but it is very rapid.
It is very rapid. It does give one concern. And that's why, when I spoke about that American air power, frankly, and personally, I would love to have seen us sustain a small presence there too. I feel like special operations forces in conjunction with Afghans and American air power and Afghan air power could really be a difference maker there in terms of holding things up. My hope was always that we could stand up enough Afghan capability that it would require very little U.S. capability augmenting them, and that there would be the political capital to sustain that U.S. presence, because we weren't losing lots of people or have lots of people invested in there. And so, yeah, I'm a little sad to see us pulling back, and concerned to see us pulling back this fast.
You said shade tree mechanics. Is this shade tree foreign policy?
Well, it's I understand this process has been going for a while now. The current administration, of course, inherited the peace deal and the talks and that sort of thing. It's passed from what I've seen it go through. Obviously America's longest wars. It's been called. It's gone through so many administrations. I knew that we needed to get to a point, and we've always needed to get to a point where this would sustain at a very minimal level of U.S. support, and that we hope that we could build that capability so that it would. So I'm concerned that we not just say, okay, that's it, training wheels off, no more U.S. support. And I know we haven't said that, but that's dramatic. But my heart goes out to
pretty close to it.
Yeah. My heart goes out to them. I love the Afghan people, and developed a lot of good relationships there, and a lot of admiration for them and what they've been through.
Can I ask, you were a major general there, and I know the Air Force does a lot more than just answer the bell from the Army to support. You're in there on strategy and planning and logistics. And simple question, who was the enemy? Who is the enemy? And were you fighting insurgents called the Taliban, or were you really fighting Pakistan?
Well, it's difficult to tell. I think the Pakistan part of this has made it as hard as anything. To have a safe haven, to have essentially a logistical base, where you can regroup and then come back across. Who knows how many, were part of that. I used to, and I still track this. You look at the percentage of the Afghan population that supports, the Taliban, and it's always been a very small percentage. And so the Pakistan part of this equation, and how they were able to leverage that, and how we get lost in Pakistan using this as a hedge, a strategic hedge against India and their presence. That has made this as hard as anything, is not having full cooperation and control over that presence in Pakistan.
Why didn't we confront Pakistan?
Oh, I think we did. The question was always, how far could we push them? I've been fascinated by the history of this whole thing from the beginning, and you can see us pushing. You can see sort of the Pakistan playing both sides, and many times here, could we have gone further? And how much further could we have gone? It's hindsight now, but it was maddening to have that base and that refuge in Pakistan, that was always going to be supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Is this another Iraq, do you think? We're going to leave? The Taliban are going to come back into certain areas. I don't know how many areas. And their ties to Al-Qaeda, there are different reads on how firm those links are. But there's a very good chance that the very reason we went into Afghanistan after 9/11 in the first place, to get rid of a launch pad for terrorism, that right, could start to return, and very quickly. Do you think we're going to have to go back into Afghanistan if we completely leave right now and abandon the Afghan government?
Well, I think we have to be ready to, absolutely, because we can't tolerate the same situation occurring again. That Al-Qaeda or other groups would have a base there from which they could launch. That's not a tenable situation for us. And so, again, as we keep thinking about this, that has to be in our minds, as well as the Taliban and what they're doing in Afghanistan, just to take over the power. The other thing I would say, though, having studied the history of Afghanistan fairly closely, there is a resilience that will surprise people, because a lot of people are just writing this off, saying the Taliban will sweep across again. But if you look at the period after the Soviet withdrawal and how long Najibullah lasted after that in the groups that, had various power bases here and there. My concern is that the situation will deteriorate into, one of these multi-centric civil war sort of situations with all these groups vying for power and the people of Afghanistan losing in the process as people try to bargain or take ground, move against one another. It really has potential to be, a humanitarian catastrophe for the people of Afghanistan as well. So I think we're going to really have to watch it. And our intervention could be many sorts. It could be an armed intervention. It could be a humanitarian intervention. I don't know, but we better be ready for everything.
And you would like us to come to that reality sooner than later. I mean, after all of that time invested in the Afghan government and training up an Afghan army, better to intervene sooner than later when there's nothing left.
Absolutely. No, we need to be thinking through, and I know people are already, what are those trigger points? And what do we do at those times so that we don't allow it to devolve into something that is almost an irretrievable catastrophe that will require even more investment than it would at this point. That's one of the things that I always thought is that, we at various times we could have argued about the level of investment in the surge. My concern was that we, again, preserve that political will and capital to sustain a presence that could keep the Afghan government going and secure the country at least to a point that they could continue to develop, and that we would forestall any groups, be it Al Qaeda, Islamic State, any of these that might threaten us.
Major General Walter Givhan, great to talk to you, sir.
Good to talk to you, Dana. Thank you.
And that's our backstory on Afghanistan. Let's hope the Afghan government can hold its ground, the Afghan army can stand up to the Taliban, and that the Biden administration in Washington doesn't completely turn its back on what NATO countries poured blood and billions of dollars into creating, an independent Afghan democracy. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening. I'm starting a summer break. I will continue to bring you podcasts, but I may miss a week or two over the summer. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletter, danalewis.substack.com. Stay loyal to Backstory and share the podcast. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.